So this is your first PowerPoint for Unit 1 of Humans in Nature, and this is an overview of the major periods that we're going to be studying about this year. So there are three major periods that we need to remember throughout world history. The first is what's called the classical period. That's the beginnings of human empires, where you start to see people moving from hunting and gathering societies into what's called sedentary societies. That means societies that are established and sedentary into one region. They tend to have certain themes to them. For example, they tend to be places that are next to river systems that create food surpluses. And eventually they consolidate and they form into smaller trading kingdoms. After that, we're going to see the post-classical period, and that's the period where you see a lot of this consolidation take place into large land-based empires that then expand outwards with military force and trade. The last major period is going to be the modern period, and that's going to be the period where we start to see a movement away from kingdoms and away from empires into nation states that we live in today that are trading with one another based upon information and technology. So human origins. So we think that humans began back in Africa somewhere about 250,000 years ago. At that time period, they tended to live in small hunting and gathering groups of just about 20 to 30 people. And as we're going to see, a lot of times there are a lot of stereotypes that people who lived in these groups lived under dire circumstances. Actually, that probably was not true. Most of the people seem to have lived, and probably because they lived next to the resources they needed and they lived in small groups, they actually tended to have everything they need and most of the time had most of their day left open for entertainment and luxury types of lifestyles, which I know goes against a lot of our typical stereotypes. About 25,000 years ago, the Little Ice Age, or changes in the climate, eventually forced people to move outside of Africa and to seek out warmer climates, and most of them ended up then in the Middle East, next to the Tigris, the Euphrates, and the Nile rivers. And that eventually then established for us sedentary societies. Humans began settling down in small kingdoms and trading cities. They almost always settled next to river systems, which makes perfect sense. They needed to have clean water systems. And this allowed them to then create an agricultural surplus. But there's also something else that this allowed for them to create. It allowed for them to create the development of bureaucracies or management systems that managed both labor systems and these irrigation systems. Now, that actually brings up some very important issues. Because human beings are settling down these sedentary societies, they began to create new technologies like metallurgy, the ability to create by bringing together different minerals and metals, iron and bronze. This eventually led to the creation of a surplus of agriculture, and it allowed humans to domesticate animals like cattle, pigs, and horses. Now, one of the big questions is why it took humans so long to do this, and one possible explanation is the effect of the Ice Age itself. So you'll notice here the relationship between nature and human beings. Climatic changes kind of force human beings to do certain actions, and then humans respond to that. Nature and human beings in Americas, though, tended to be different from those in the Middle East. While American societies actually were far larger than those in Africa, Middle East, or Europe. In most of the cases, Middle East and Europe tended to have at the most 10,000, maybe 20,000 people in their societies, while in the Mesoamerican region, so that would be from Mexico down to South America, most of the big kingdoms tended to have anywhere from 200,000 or more people within their civilizations. Which is rather odd because when you think about it, the Mesoamerican region was largely deserty. It was also very disconnected from one another due to the large mountain ranges, especially the Andes mountain ranges. So it's very interesting that the people in Mesoamerica were able to establish these large, complex civilizations that supported such a huge base of population. However, the Mesoamerican regions did have some disadvantages that would eventually have some pretty negative impacts on them. For example, they did not have cereal grains. They tended to farm what is known as maize or corn. That didn't allow for the same kind of nutrition that people would have within the Middle Eastern region. Also, people who were down in the Mesoamerican region had very few labor animals that could not allow them to domesticate and use as pack animals. The main animal used within Mesoamerica was the llama. Which did fine for carrying goods back and forth, but it just wasn't enough in comparison, for example, to the horse or the oxen or the buffalo out in the African region and the Middle Eastern region. And this brings up a big issue that we're going to be looking at throughout this course, but very important in this first unit about humans in nature, and it's the question of geographical determinism. So one theory about human development is the belief that nature determines what we do. And the idea behind this that we've already seen is the idea that human beings were pushed out by the Ice Age. They settled down because they need water. They settled down next to rivers. That forces them then to create bureaucracies. Now, think about what that means. If you buy into this notion of geographical determinism, it means that ideas themselves are not ideas we come up with. They're ideas that are forced upon us by nature. This means that we really don't have freedom. Freedom is an illusion. Now, one of the criticisms I would bring up with this is what's known as monocausal explanations. So the idea of a monocausal explanation is that there's basically one cause that then causes single effects to take place in history. There is an alternative model to think about how we can look at history, and it's known as overdetermination. The idea is that there are multiple causes that take place, and eventually these causes will coalesce into some kind of threshold. And that then leads into multiple effects. Well, how do we hit these multiple effects? There's some kind of tipping point that throws us into the events. So, like, for example, we're eventually going to talk about this with World War I. A lot of people tend to think of the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand in World War I as being the cause of World War I. But in actuality, we've had a lot of assassinations, we've had a lot of crises that have not led into world wars. The reason why the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand probably was our tipping point into World War I is because there were so many other events that led up to it. And that's the idea of a tipping point. But if you think about it, this really brings up a very fascinating issue, and it's the issue of complexity and free will. If it's true that we do not have singular causes, we actually have a complexity of causes, then that means that there are so many things going on, we really can't pinpoint the one thing that forces us to do stuff. This means that we do have free will, that we can actually organize different types of causes into having the threshold that we need to go into different types of events. So this brings us into the major classical empires of the time period. And the first one is India. So in India, the first major group were the Harappan. The Harappan were farming groups that were disconnected from each other over the subcontinent. They were eventually invaded by a group of people called the Aryans, who came from the eastern part of Europe. And when they invaded in, they created a caste system. That caste system was based upon labor specialization and racial distinctions. Now, I want to be careful with this. When we talk about race, we're probably thinking about the race of today. That's not really what we're talking about here. Race and racism of today is definitely not the same as the racial distinctions of the past. But in this particular case here, we have Aryans who are coming from the eastern side of Europe who are fair-skinned. As they're coming in, they need labor specialization, and here they come into a part of the world where the people look very different from them. This allowed them then to make distinctions, and the distinctions were connotations of race that allowed them to then force people into doing different types of labor. Now, eventually, India would be centralized under an empire known as the Mauryan Empire, and the leader of the Mauryan Empire was at first extremely brutal. The emperor was a man named Ashoka, but after he was able to centralize the empire, he then converted over to a very peaceful reform movement of Hinduism, and that is Buddhism. After the Mauryan Empire collapsed, a new empire was formed called the Gupta, who tried to centralize further, but they were really unsuccessful in doing so. And in fact, this would be a problem for India throughout its history. It was so large with so many different types of people, it was very difficult to centralize under one power. So the caste system that was formed looks something like this. At the very top were called the Brahmins, or the priests. Below them were the Kshatriya, or the warriors. Below them were the Vaishyas, or the merchants. And below them were the Sudras, or the commoners. And below them were the untouchables. This system would eventually become part of what's called Hinduism. And eventually Buddhism would be a reformed system of Hinduism, which would actually reject the caste system. Notice here that the caste system, which is a religious belief system, was really formed in many ways to form a system of categorization, especially for labor purposes. So the next classical empire is Greece. Greece was very similar to India, founded by a group of migrants from Eastern Europe, and those are the Mycenaeans. The Mycenaeans came down from Europe into Greece. The problem in Greece, though, was a lack of arable land. And so because of that, Greece ended up being formed on these islands that had very rocky land, and it led to very small organizations called city-states or polis, which tended to be dominated by the wealthy landowners. There were two major ones I want to remember, and that's Sparta and Athens, although there were about 150 of these city-states. The two big leaders were Sparta and Athens. Sparta ended up creating a militaristic society, while Athens created a democracy, but it wasn't a democracy the way we think of it. It was an aristocratic democracy. Only about 1/3 of the people could vote or could argue about political issues. The other 2/3 were women, slaves and the poor. They were not allowed to vote or take part in the commons and the debates. Eventually, the Persians attempted to lead a fight against Sparta and Athens. The Persians lost, but Sparta and Athens, in fighting with each other against the Persians, eventually ended up fighting against each other as they tried to maintain control over this region. And at the very end of what were known as the Peloponnesian Wars, Sparta defeated Athens, but so weakened each other that they were easily taken over after that time period. The next major classical empire was Rome. Rome was initially created as a republic by the Etruscans in the mountains of Italy. There was a major conflict that took place over land inequality between two groups, the wealthy landowning patricians and the poor plebeians. Over time, this conflict became so large that there was a need to solve it by gaining more land. So the Romans expanded outwards, but as they did that, they came up against northern Africa, and they came against a major power at the time, Carthage. Carthage and Rome ended up getting into 3 wars called the Punic Wars, and at the very end of it, Carthage was defeated. But in order to be defeated, the Roman Senate had to turn over power to the Roman generals. And as the Roman generals took more and more power, they ended up creating a massive land-based empire. A fourth classical empire is the Empire of China. China has numerous different dynasties that we'll be studying about this year. They started off with a mythical dynasty we really don't know if they existed called the Jia. The Jia were farming groups that settled by rivers. Sounds very familiar with some of the other societies that we have studied about. And after them, you started to see this need for centralization. And so the next dynasty was the Zhang dynasty. It formed a centralized power. They were overthrown by a rebellious group called the Chu. The Chu rebelled against them and then justified that through what they called the Mandate of Heaven. The Mandate of Heaven was a teaching that the emperor must rule justly or he will be overthrown. Well, the Chu were overthrown, and when they were overthrown, the Chinese system led to an era of warring states in which there was a breakdown, in which there was no centralized control, and so for centuries there was a fight between different warring groups, and they ended up creating new ideas for governance. So this is why China ends up being so complicated at this time period, and also a leader of the world at this time period. 2 empires would arise, the Qin and the Han. The Qin was led by Emperor Qin Shi Huang. He believed in Chinese legalism, the philosophy that stressed that absolute power had to be given to the emperor to maintain control. The Han came after the Qin, and they were led primarily by Liu Bang. Liu Bang believed in Chinese Confucianism, the idea that society was best ordered through obligations by each of the classes towards each other, like living in a large family. So the main problem for both of these empires is going to be the problem of the fight for land between nobles and the emperor. The Han tried to resolve this through a system based upon Confucianism called the Wellfilled System. So here's what the Wellfilled System looked like. Now this is going to be extremely important for just being illustrative of one of the ways that China tried to solve its problems. So you notice here we have 3 circles. The peasants' land is the largest in size, but not the largest in width. The largest in width is the nobles' land. Peasants would farm on their land. They would also farm on the nobles' land. When they did that, they could keep some of the crop, but then some of the crop would also have to go to the nobles. The nobles would then send some of that in taxes to the emperor's land, and they would have certain peasants farm on the emperor's land itself. The emperor's land overall was seen as sacred, and so that was seen as in control of everything else. But notice that each one of these systems is meant to be in balance with each other and interconnected to each other. So this was meant to establish a system of relationships to solve the problem of land inequality. So another group were the classical groups of Africa. Africa had been impacted by the Little Ice Age, and so one of the major groups in that area was a migratory group called the Bantu tribes. The Bantu tribes lived in northern western Africa. They moved south and then they moved to the east. They carried with them 2 very important things, iron and new languages. Now the reason why the Bantu are so important is that they are going to settle along the eastern African coastline, and they're going to set up a whole bunch of different cities there that will then become trading ports along the Indian Ocean. That's going to be really important as we move on from outside of here, because the Indian Ocean is going to be a massive trade route that will take place along the coastline from East Africa up to the Middle East and then over into India. Not only were there numerous types of goods that were traded, also ideas and religions. So you're going to have everything from Christianity to Islam to Hinduism traveling back and forth between this region.